So, good afternoon. I am pleased to introduce very briefly our next keynote speaker, Professor Antonio Baldassarre, Vice Dean and Research Director at the Lutheran University of Applied Sciences and Arts. And the main area of his research are related to 19th and 20th century music, music iconography, and cultural studies of music. And he was member and director of many important musicological organizations. Today, his keynote lecture is dedicated to the Čiurlionis as Proto-Pioneer of audiovisual and multimedia arts. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I hope I will fulfill the wishes that you have actually now brought on stage here to speak. Anyhow, so anyone coming from, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and for the invitation. I was very flattered when I was asked to actually give a brief keynote on Čiurlionis, because my first acquaintance with Čiurlionis was some 10 or whatever years ago through a footnote. And by coincidence, Ruta and myself, we were sitting in the same bus during a conference, you still remember, in New York City. And I asked Ruta, can you tell me how you actually pronounced his name, Čiurlionis? So since then, that's my first encounter. And so I also met Ruta for the first time. Anyhow. So let's start. Anyone coming from Switzerland to Lithuania to deliver a keynote on the occasion of Čiurlionis' 150th birthday might feel like bringing coats to Newcastle. Despite his short life, the creative output of this rare polymath during Lithuania's cultural revival at the beginning of the 20th century secured his place a fundamental figure in Lithuanian music and visual arts tradition. The profound and hardly inseparable interconnectedness of visual art and music in Čiurlionis' oeuvre has led many scholars, and justifiable so, to regard him as a pioneer of musical painting, as an artist who created an innovative synthesis of compositional principles from both disciplines, and who orchestrated a unified aesthetic language rather than simply borrowing elements from one art form or the other. Against this background, the following considerations will contend that the conventional framing of his artistic accomplishments as merely a symbolist or a surrealist or nationally significant, though partially valid, underestimates the radical originality and conceptual depth of his contribution to early modernist aesthetics. By systematically fusing musical constructions into structures into painting and visual techniques into music, Čiurlionis established a practice that prefigured central principles of intermedia and multimedia art in the 20th and 21st centuries. To be sure, Čiurlionis' distinctive visual qualities were acknowledged early on. For the eminent Russian painter and writer Nicholas Rokhin, it was clear that Čiurlionis, quote, was not a mere innovator, but entirely new. And the influential Swiss historian and critic of architecture, Siegfried Giedion, emphasized within a comparison between Čiurlionis and Kandinsky's achievements that the first, quote, is noteworthy for the universality and timelessness, while the latter's art is referring to Kandinsky, the latter's art is, the best sense, only the ornamentation of a certain period of artistic development, end of quote. Despite such and other enthusiastic affirmations, Čiurlionis' visual and musical achievements eventually passed in into oblivion for quite a long time, largely due to the incompatibility of his stylistic and iconographic visual language with the classificatory framework conventionally employed in art history and musicology. Čiurlionis' distinctive artistic tragedy appears to have begun during the study residency in Warsaw in late 1890s. Having first acquired a solid musical foundation, initially under the guidance of his father Konstantinos Čiurlionis, and later through instructions at the orchestral school of Duke Orginskis in Plungey, he enrolled at the age of 18, as many of you know, at the Warsaw Conservatory of Music. There, he firstly pursued piano studies before turning to composition. I skipped this one. This rigorous formation at the Warsaw Conservatory culminated in several notable piano and vocal works, most notably the Cantata de Profundis for mixed choir and orchestra, Čiurlionis' diploma work, as we well know. Čiurlionis' creative pursuits, however, extended well beyond music during this period in Warsaw. He also turned to literature and philosophy and further deepened his commitment to drawing and painting, interests he had already begun to cultivate in Plungey. Later, he professionalized this interest through studies, first at the Warsaw Drawing School and finally at the Warsaw School of Fine Arts after a brief and unhappy interlude at the Leipzig Conservatory from 1901 to 1902. We have already heard about that. During the studies at the School of Fine Arts, Čiurlionis was immersed in a rich and diverse spectrum of stylistic currents, which likely nurtured his inherently interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary interest. The following discussion develops this argument further by examining first examples of Čiurlionis' visual output that underscores the broader implications, deliberately avoiding first in the discussion works with titles that already allude to music, such as the early cycle Funeral Symphony or the 7 visual sonata cycles, in order to demonstrate, and that's very important for me, that musical structuring principles permeate Čiurlionis' visual oeuvre beyond overtly verbal references to music in titles. The musical element, to quote Landesbergis, presents, quote, itself inwardly and formally as an achievement in the plastic arts, a phenomenon hitherto unique, end of quote. As a first example, Čiurlionis' painting, and I'm pretty sure everybody of you know that, painting Peace or Serenity has been selected, of which exist various versions. There's another one. The painting must undoubtedly be situated within a broader context of the contemporary reception of the highly influential Swiss symbolist painter Arnold Böcklin, whose impact also extended profoundly into Eastern Europe, the Baltic regions, and Russia. In the case of Čiurlionis' Serenity, the allusion to Böcklin's Toteninsel, or in English, the island of dead, are too pronounced to be ignored. Here you have the version. One version which actually Čiurlionis became acquainted with the 5th version of Böcklin's iconic painting of 1886 during a visit to the Museum der Bildenden Künste in Leipzig while residing in the city for his musical studies. This is documented by a letter to Moravsky dated from 20 May 1902. In the context of this paper, the evident reception of Böcklin, however, is of secondary importance. What proves more significant is the question of how Serenity enacts a musicalization of pictorial composition. Serenity constitutes an outstanding example of, an outstanding example of Čiurlionis' virtuoso ability to translate musical structures and concepts of expression into pictorial language. Within this painting, various musical principles such as polyphony, imitation, and so on and so forth, techniques and forms that Čiurlionis consequently employed in his musical oeuvre emerge as the central structuring device that governs the pictorial composition. Vladimir Fedotov has persuasively maintained that serenity exemplifies, quote, a dissembled harmonization of themes, end of quote, a device he regards as one of the most effective means of polyphonic composition. Dissembled harmonization of themes is, according to Fedotov, achieved by a melody covering intervals largely than a tone. A sound left in such a way remains in a listener's memory until the melody reaches the neighboring sound. Sounds left with a leap connect a dissembled voice within a one-voiced exposition. In this way, a one-voiced part splits into several voices, Bach's violin solo sonata, for example. Having drawn a parallel between dissembled polyphony and poetic metaphor, we can easily discover a named theme and a secondary, unnamed theme in Čiurlionis' work. The operation of this technique becomes particularly apparent regarding serenity when further iterations of the pictorial subjects are employed in this analysis. Namely, a postcard of 1903. It presents an anthropomorphic figuration, conceivable a dragon or monster, that emerges from the water and whose iconographic interpretation as a kind of monstrous hybrid is underscored by tail fins and two luminous fire-like eyes. The superimposition of two pictorial strata, namely figure 1 and 3, into a single visual composition, as evident in figure 2, and engenders what Fedotov identifies as a form of dissembled polyphony, or a counterpoint of association. The named theme, serenity, is both completed and simultaneously juxtaposed by an unnamed theme that expresses maybe psychological anxiety. This interpretation is corroborated by Čiurlionis' aforementioned letter to Moravsky, composed at the time of the exploration of the serenity topic, in which he states, "I enjoy silence, but today I cannot stand it. It seems as if I am being followed by something that the shadows. It's frightening. I was struck by the idea that an important secret might lie here. At moments, it felt as if this quiet and dark night was a monster, sprawling itself over the surroundings and breathing over ever so slowly. Great, wide open and still eyes filled with deep indifference and an important secret of some act." Another striking instance of what Fedotov called counterpoint of association can be found in the first painting of Čiurlionis' Winter Cycle, a series of 8 works executed in 1907. In this instance, the animated winter landscape, articulated through falling snowflakes and a tree, is juxtaposed with an unanimated counterpart as the tree simultaneously assumes the form of a candelabrum. The dialectic of natural life and symbolic studies underscores the concept of associative counterpoint, embracing the themes of illumination, ritual, and transcendence. Čiurlionis' painting, Hymn number 3, the final work of a cycle of 3, is commonly interpreted as representing, I quote from the catalogue, a harp orchestra, end of quote, consisting of at least 5 kneeling opera players, which while such a reading cannot be dismissed as implausible, it overlooks the evident fact that Čiurlionis is here employing the technique of imitation, as emphasizing by the almost identical shaping of the harpist, alluding to the musical feature according which imitation is a repetition of a melodic contour or one part of by another. The culmination of imitative techniques in music is, without doubt, and all the music theories might actually agree with me, the fugue, which scholarship constantly designates as the most august of musical forms, or the queen of musical forms even. In view of the consideration as outlined up to this point, it is scarcely surprising that Čiurlionis should have transposed this technique into the domain of visual language. Perhaps the most striking evidence in this context is now a painting which bears a musical title, Fugue, from 1908. The principal pictorial motive of the painting consists of hills, waves, and silhouettes of sitting or boring figures, that these motifs are arranged in recurring or horizontal layers. The stratification and ordering of the motifs endow the depiction with a pronounced rhythmic quality, one that not only underscores its compositional logic, but also generates a dynamic interplay between repetition and variation. This rhythmic structuring lends the image a kind of musical resonance in which the successive layers and recurring form guide the viewer's gaze across the pictorial field. So it actually creates movement, so to speak. It can hardly be overlooked that the painting provides a visual fugue. According to Čiurlionis, sorry, I'm pretty sure I completely pronounced the name wrongly. The upper section of the painting presents an opposition between a clearly defined subject, the fear motive, and a counter-subject rendered as an indistinct nebulous form. The juxtaposition simultaneously introduces inversion, one of the most characteristic devices of polyphonic technique. However, the corresponding visual elements do not maintain precise analogical relation with the real counterparts. One fear motif, as you can easily see, produces two reflections symmetrically disposed on either side of the axis, whereas two other fears yield a single central reflection. Such apparent inconsistency clearly underscore that the painting is not merely an analogy of musical principle, but rather follows the topic of the concept of musicalization of the visual, a concept that gained particular significance at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and that I have examined in an earlier study. In the painting's succeeding layer, the composition unfolds what might, in the terminology of fugue theory, be termed development and recapitulation, articulated through augmentations and diminutions of the fear motive. Finally, the painting's lowest layer, that represents in musical terminology a kind of coda. The depiction condenses all formal elements and compositional devices. A sustained pedal point, rhythmic figuration, and the superimposition of motifs characteristics for a stretto in music. Closely consistent with this interpretation, although emphasizing different aspects of the same structural resemblance between painting and music, Fedotov argues that the principle of repetition within the painting unfolds in conformity with the rules of perspective and subsequent takes the form of a thematic re-entry, which may be understood as a second exposition of the onset of the development section. The reflection in the water in the upper register, according to Fedotov, functions as a transformed statement of the subject, suggesting processes of variation and augmentation. the contrapuntal dialogue between the subject and its original form, and its evolving transformation generates the pictorial fugue's third phrase, which may be linked to the reprise section. While Fedotov interpretation builds upon and refines Čiurlionis, both share the conceptual framework of reading the painting as a visual fugue structured by repetition, variation, and symmetry. Fedotov extends Čiurlionis' idea by introducing a spatial and perspectival dimension to the musical analogy. In essence, both interpretations may share the assumption that the transformation of musical temporality into pictorial spatiality is structured isomorphic with the organization of a musical score. Čiurlionis' engagement with polyphonic techniques in visual context during the first decade of the 20th century may be understood as anticipating or even foreshadowing the exploration of visual musical interrelationships undertaken by artists such as Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, Lionel Feininger, and Johannes Itten, to name a few of many a decade later. For Klee in particular, himself, like Čiurlionis, an accomplished musician, the model of polyphonic compositional practice served as an orientation point for his celebrated watercolor fugue in red. In this work, floating colored forms of geometric configurations are rhythmically repeated and layered in overlapping sequences that progress from dark to light. The temporal and dynamic qualities of the music are rendered graphically through the gradual unfolding of form as shapes emerge from a dark ground and advance toward a state of heightened luminosity and transparency. However, a substantial difference central to the art historical assessment of Čiurlionis' significance emerges in comparison with Klee. In Čiurlionis, the polyphonic principle operates upon a still representational, though highly symbolic charged pictorial language that it constructs, deconstructs, and again reconstructs. In Klee, in contrast, polyphony itself becomes the pictorial subject unfolding within a non-representational realm governed exclusively by relations of form and color. Viewed in this line, Čiurlionis appears not merely as an important representative, but as a forerunner of the current within the visual art which, since the rise of abstraction, has sought ever more strongly to forge links with music. The situation is different and even more complicated in the case of Kandinsky, who consistently maintained that he was the first, quote, the first painter who grounded painting upon purely pictorial means of expression and who eliminated the representational form of the image, end of quote. And in support of this his own claim, he even seems to have antedated by 2 years of his famous, originally untitled watercolor, and later designated it as the first abstract watercolor. By contrast, the Estonian poet and art critic Alexis Rannet considered it beyond doubt that the title of the first abstract painter probably belonged to Čiurlionis, a claim he sustained with references to the summer and winter cycles for which the Winter's 8 painting work, here it is, with his pronounced structural affinity to musical polyphony may serve as an example to illustrate Rennet's argument. Setting aside the perennial and in a certain way also unproductive debate over who may claim precedence as the first abstract painter, I'm really not interested in discussion. It is undoubtedly that first, music constituted a foundational dimension of Kandinsky's art. operating not merely as a source of inspiration, but also as an indispensable structural paradigm. I have argued elsewhere it was particularly Schoenberg's music with which Kandinsky was acquainted by a visit of an old Schoenberg concert in 1910, the first time, that exposed a significant impact on Kandinsky and his theoretical thinking. The music proved decisive in catalyzing the painter's development and toward pictorial abstraction. A paradigmatic, or maybe the most paradigmatic instance in this regard is the well-known painting by Kandinsky, composition number 7, for which the artist produced nearly 30 preliminary studies. The notion of dissonance operates as the generative structural determinant of the pictorial narrative and is formally arranged around both a powerful diagonal from the bottom to the left upper right and a centric motif that is slightly shifted downward to the left from the image center. The painting's dynamic dissonance of forms and colors may be undertook as evoking Schoenberg's contemporary composition practice in which freie Tonalität or free tonality formed the central locus of aesthetic and theoretical engagement, and as exemplified in the string quartet number 2 in F sharp minor, and of course the 3 piano pieces opus 11. 2 pieces that Kandinsky has heard the first time at the Munich concert. Within the framework of traditional color theory, within the framework of traditional color theory, violet and green, for instance, occupy diametrically opposed loci on the color wheel. Simultaneously, the 2 shades of green in the concentric central motif articulate a proximate relation, closely analogous to the semitonal tension of the minor second diads, which imparts its animating force, for instance, in the first of Schoenberg's 3 piano pieces, and which is already paradigmatically foregrounded in the work's opening bars as a structural topos. The compositional structure in Kandinsky's canvas demonstrably radiates outward from the pictorial center. As Boland further observes, the concentric circle motif at the painting center assumes a generative role. Structurally, this recalls what George Pearl has termed a cell in Schoenberg's music. It is an imitating gesture that generates subsequent development, and in essence points to the principle of developing variation that Schoenberg has employed to describe Brahms's technique of continuous motivic transformation, whereby new ideas continually emerge and unfold from an initial material. The procedure becomes evident in Kandinsky when the canvas is approached from the center. The circle, triangle and rectangular, as well as the red-blue motif that emerges after the initial grouping of violet, teal and green and expands in parallel with the development of the central motif, creates a so-called symphony of geometric figures and vibrant colors. The 2 color grouping reappear in the upper register of the painting, whereas the diminutive yellow inflection within the central motif acquires heightened prominence along on the left side of the composition. These brief reflections on Kandinsky's composition number 7 point to a fundamental distinction, in my opinion, from Čiurlionis in the application of musical techniques and principles. In Kandinsky, I would argue that this operates above all as a framework to provide orientation for the arrangement of distribution of forms, lines, and colors. In Čiurlionis, by contrast, musical techniques function less as a mere ordering device than as a generative, poetic principle that determines pictorial structures and semantics, and that saturates the very fabric of the image. Consequently, Kandinsky once emphatically declared in his Über das Geistige in der Kunst, quote, "I do not want to paint music, I only want to paint good, necessary living pictures which are experienced probably by at least a few viewers," end of quote. Ultimately, he maintained that music and painting, as we have heard yesterday in the keynote by our colleague from Oxford, each possesses their own specific quality, while nonetheless acknowledging analogies between the two arts. Against the background of the considerations presented so far, a concluding attempt may be pursued to situate Čiurlionis' visual oeuvre within the conceptual and epistemological framework of intermediality and, more specifically, of intermedia art as pronounced in both the title and the introductory remarks of this keynote. Intermediality and intermedia art, a term introduced in the mid-1960s by the artist and co-founder of the international Fluxus movement, Dick Higgins, are characterized by the crossing and blending of artistic media, whether through the transfer of principle from one art form into another, the creation of hybrid forms that resist classification within a single medium, or the cultivation of an analogical correspondence that broadens aesthetic perception across sensory registers. As Higgins describes it, that's not the one. That's Kandinsky. Here we are. Part of the reason that Duchamp's objects are fascinating while Picasso's voice is fading is that the Duchamp pieces are truly between media, between sculpture and something else, while a Picasso is readily classifiable as a painted ornament, end of quote. In this respect, Čiurlionis offers one of the clearest examples of intermedia practice. As both painter and composer, he did not merely borrow musical terminology, but structurally organized entire cycles of paintings according to musical forms, such as the sonata, prelude, and fugue, and so on and so forth. Here, music functions not simply as a metaphor, but as a generative principle that shapes the very composition, rhythm, and semantic depth of the visual work, producing genuine hybrids that dissolve the boundaries between painting and music. Čiurlionis may just be regarded as a proto-intermedia artist whose oeuvre anticipates the later 20th century avant-garde and more systematic search for a genuinely synthetic art form, situating him as an important, though unacknowledged figure in the broader genealogy of intermedia practices. Furthermore, it may be worth considering the possibility that Čiurlionis' pictorial oeuvre, that's a thought that I just came up yesterday after my colleague's keynote, colleague from Oxford, and the discussion we had later here in front of the table. So further, it may be worth considering the possibility of Čiurlionis' pictorial oeuvre should not be approached primarily as a contribution to the history of art, but rather as an intervention within the history of music, particularly insofar as his paintings can be construed as a form of visual source. Such a perspective opens up a critical space for reflection within the discursive framework of conceptual art, inviting a reconsideration of epistemic boundaries between the visual and auditory modalities of artistic thought. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for your rich and inspiring lecture. And now we have some time for questions and discussion.
Labai ačiū. Atsiprašau, gal kažkas kiti norės, aš bijau, kad užimti eterį. Aš manau, labai įdomus dalykas, pavyzdžiui, labai garsus paveikslas su eglutė. Aš kaip muzikologė, aš galiu jį perskaityti grinai muzikologiniais terminais. Fugos. Čiurlionis buvo puikus polifonistas. Yra laiškuose. Jadasonas labai jį gyrė, netgi laiškuose, ir vienam jis rašo. Jadasonas pažiūrėjo mano kontrapunktus ir pasakė wunderschön. Ir perdavė linkėjimą Noskovskijui, kad padėkot, kad išugdė tokį polifonistą. Tai va tas eglutės, jeigu aš žiūriu, aš galiu visiškai vartot fugos polifonijos terminus. Fuga kaip tema, eglutė kaip tema, tada eina jos inversija, apvertimas, atspindys, ar ne, muzikologai, tada vėl tema kitam balse, o tada eina kontrapunktas arba intermedia, o tada kontraekspozicija. Reiškia, ekspozicijos pakartojimas dar kartą kitaip. Ir vėl, lygiai, va mergino, žinot, turbūt polifonija mokosi, ar ne? Toliau, kai yra kulminacija, labai Čiurlionis mėgo aukso pjūvis, ten yra absoliučiai aukso pjūvis, sustambinta tema, apačioj stambi eglutė. Ir va tie kalnai, kaip sakė, tai yra intermedijos. Ir ko gero netgi keletą, jų yra ir keli sluoksniai. Dabar lygiai tas pats su sonatom. Tapybiniam sonatom ciklai, absoliučiai atkartoti muzikiniai, sonatiniai, simfoniniai ciklai, ar ne? Čia sėdi studentės ir muzikologai. Juk žiūrėkit, 4 dalis. Pirma, homo agens, veikiantis žmogus, kūrybingas, kovojantis ir taip toliau. Antra dalis būna visada rami, homo sapiens, besilsintis žmogus, mąstantis. Trečia, ar ne, tada homo liudens, besilinksminantis žmogus, tai ir būdavo skerco arba kažkoks, menuetas ar dar kažkaip. Ir homo komunis, finalas, bendraujantis žmogus. Žodžiu, labai įdomu, kad galima jo paveikslus perskaityti muzikiniam sąvokom. Ir turbūt tą reikia ir daryti, ar ne? Bet tada mes tikrai parodysim sintezę, tikrą. Tai ačiū, nenoriu ilgai laikyti.
Thank you very much.
So, in fact, Gražina just developed and added additional arguments to your talk, speaking that it's possible to interpret all the paintings of Čiurlionis as from a musicological perspective, just using the musicological definitions and concepts.
Actually, I was already afraid that I will get a total critical comment. Actually, it goes in my line. I truly think, and I'm convinced more and more, the more I look at images and paintings of Čiurlionis, that we maybe, and that's just a hypothesis, I have to further develop that, we maybe look wrongly at it. Maybe we should shift our gaze and our thinking of his pictorial more into what is actually then explored in the 50s, 60s and so on, with actually the pictorial score, which then actually, when composers came to the status in which they realized that the 5 stage or the 5 lines are no longer really is sufficient enough to express their musical ideas. And maybe, I emphasize maybe, because I didn't do the research there, maybe we should actually consider such a dimension in Čiurlionis' work as well, pictorial work as well. And that's why I would emphatically invite the people from the complete edition, as it was done with Schönberg, to include the pictorial work as well. It is part of Čiurlionis' achievements to include that as well.
More questions? Yes, please. Professor Andrijauskas.
Ačiū labai. Aš buvau labai entuziastingas šalininkas kolegą pakviesti į šį kongresą, kadangi perskaičiau puikų tekstą, kuris kaip tik buvo skirtas menų sąveikai. Man klausant pranešimą labai įdomus buvo pastebėjimas, daugeliui turbūt mažiau žinoma, šveicarų architektūros teoretiko Zigmundo Gideono, kuris kaip tik aktyviai dalyvavo diskusijoje dėl Čiurlionio, bet pats nuostabiausias dalykas galbūt yra tai, kad viename iš jo ne architektūros istorijai skirtose knygose, bet aš prisimenu, skaičiau straipsnį ir mane kas apstulbino skaitant, kad jisai kalbėjo apie muzikinę formų architektoniką, praktiškai tos pačius žodžius, kuriuos kalbėjo Čiurlionis, ką reikia mokyti. Tai šitas labai svarbus pastebėjimas. Dabar antras labai svarbus dalykas, kurį aš girdėjau jūsų puikiam pranešime. Aš vis dėlto galvoju ir norėjau jūsų paklausti, kad priežastis buvo ne dėl to, kad jisai tapo Čiurlionis, jisai per daug įvairus buvo. Ne todėl, kad jisai tapo neaktualus. Priežastis buvo labai paprasta. Jisai buvo prakeikto likimo menininkas. Visur pavėlavo ir jisai pats svarbiausias dalykas. Po 10 ir 12 metų jisai 67 metus nebuvo niekur eksponuojamas. 50 metų buvo sovietinė okupacija, buvo kiti baisus. Kaip galėjo neužmiršti dailininko, nes aš minėjau, po mirtinių parodų tai buvo garsiausias Rusijos imperijos dailininkas. Karas tuoj pat prasidėjęs nukirto visus labai ilgam. Tai šitą motyvą aš ypatingai norėčiau pabrėžti, bet man paliko labai didelį įspūdį lyginant su kitais teoretikais jūsų, kad jūs vis dėlto labai dažnai vakarų teoretikams stinga labai svarbaus dalyko. Tai yra atsirėmimo į autentiškus Čiurlionio tekstus, kurie yra fantastiniai. Ir tai yra didžiausia čiurlionistikos problema, kuri reikalinga būtinai versti, nes kai tik tu atsirėmi, pavyzdžiui, aš ir tą Gideono frazę, jūs tiesiog palygintumėt ir apstulptumėt. Suprantat, kad praktiškai tais pačiais žodžiais pasako. Ir čiurlionistikoje tokių dalykų yra nepaprastai daug. Todėl vienas nuostabiausių jūsų dalykų tekstuose, tai yra tai, kad jūs puikiai stengiatės integruoti, ne abstrakčiai kalbate, bet ir menotyrinė analizė, ir tekstinė analizė, ir faktologinė. Tas labai svarbu yra kompleksinis dalykas bet kokiai menotyrai ir bet kokiam tyrinėjimui. Nepaprastai jums dėkingas. Ačiū.
Thank you very much for your comment, and I actually will take that into consideration, and I will come back to you for the bibliographical note as far as Gideon is concerned. It was interesting. I grew up on the other side of the street where Gideon actually lived, and so that's why through Čiurlionis I came back to Gideon, so to speak. But I come back to you for the bibliographical note, and I completely agree with you. And actually this is one of my major principle that I share with my students, and which I have in the context of Čiurlionis not followed. That I always say to my students, do research only about someone or something you understand the language or are able to learn it. So that's why I have many students who do whatever, Italian opera or Russian opera, but don't speak any word of that. Anyhow, I did not follow that principle as far as Čiurlionis is concerned, because my Lithuanian is not only rusty, it is not even existing. So that's why I'm happy that AI was invented only for that reason, but that's not the solution to it. But I come back to you. Thank you very much for your comment.
Ar būtų dar klausimų? Tai prašau, Vita Gruodytė.
Aš taip pat lietuviškai pasakysiu. Labai nuostabiai išdėstėte tą muzikalumą Čiurlionio paveiksluose, apie kurį daug kalbama, apskritai apie jo paveikslų muzikalumą, vien tik tai sonatų pavadinimai, ar ne? Bet jo muzikoje yra daug tapybiškumo. Pavyzdžiui, yra ta tokia linija, kuri kyla, nusileidžia kaip banga. Ir faktiškai tam tikri archetipai, kuriuos jis naudoja visam savo mąstyme, ar ne, jie cirkuliuoja ir sakykime, muzikalūs, tam tikros formos ir tam tikros struktūros, ir vienoj srity, ir kitoj, bet mes labai mažai kalbame apie jo muzikos vaizdingumą, na, išskyrus, sakykime, jūrą arba miške, kurios jau tokios labai akivaizdžios, bet pačioj kalboj turbūt čia nėra priekaištas, čia tiesiog, kad gali būti, kad tokio paties svarbumo dailės įspaudas į muziką yra kaip muzikos įspaudas į dailę. Tik tai toks
I totally agree with you, and I actually found myself as yourself yesterday in the same position. My lecture goes for 10 pages forwards, and there's the music in it, and I completely agree with you. It's correct that when I talk about intermediality and intermedia art, then of course the music needs to be included. And we have already a couple of studies in which this kind of perspective is included. I agree with you, and I don't know if the organizers plan to do a publication. This part will be included. It's on these pages here, unfortunately. So, I agree with you.
Ar būtų dar klausimų, nes mūsų laukia šiandien dar daug renginių. Tai tuomet, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.